I'd like to begin by acknowledging country. I'm working at home in my home in Northcote, which is on Wurundjeri land as part of the Kulin Nation. And I want to acknowledge not simply the elders past and present, but I also want to acknowledge the deep wisdom that comes from 2,000 generations or 60,000 years of custodianship over this country that is our home. I'd also like to acknowledge our childcare workers, mainly women, who have been tirelessly attempting to provide quality service for decades now, despite a lack of appropriate support over time from governments. So, and I think in particular, the way they dealt with this issue through the grueling 2020 pandemic experience. And now I'd like to acknowledge our speakers, our panelists today, who have given their time freely for this event. So if I could introduce them and indicate that at first I'll field questions to the panelists, and then we'll take questions from you who are present in this Zoom audience. So we're delighted to have the company of Professor Fiona Stanley, first and foremost an epidemiologist, but an outstanding advocate in this country for public health and children's health. Fiona is UNICEF ambassador, Australian ambassador for early childhood. She was named Australian of the Year way back in 2003, and I think also a year later was deemed one of our living treasures. She was founding director of the Telethon Kids Institute in Perth in 1990. She was made a Companion of the Order of Australia in 1996, way back. And in 2002, Fiona launched the Australian Research Alliance for Children and Youth. We are absolutely delighted to have Fiona present with us today. We're also in the company of Rana Hussain, who I'm delighted to say is a fellow board member with me at the Victorian Women's Trust. I'm not so delighted to say that she was a diversity and inclusion leader at the Richmond Football Club, because we have different passions, but her passion for diversity and inclusion marks her out as an aspiring and inspirational leader in the Australian community, especially in the area of sport and diversity, but being able to extend that to a whole lot of other spheres. We have an apology, sadly, from Georgie Dent today. She's not able at the last minute to attend, so I'll be fielding questions to others on the panel. But I would really commend you to, in case I forget later, to follow the work of Georgie's organisation, of which she is executive director, called The Parenthood. The Parenthood has released a paper in February of this year, in which I think it's a brilliant encapsulation and snapshot of a lot of issues facing parents in this country, including early childhood learning. And finally, last but not least, Christina Hobbs, CEO of Verve Super. Christina is an experienced board director in the superannuation industry, a former Deloitte management consultant. She's worked as a humanitarian and financial inclusion expert for the United Nations for well over a decade, is a former board director of the Global Women's Project, certainly published author on gender equality, and leads this path-breaking superannuation company for women in particular called Verve Super. So welcome to this very distinguished panelists, and thank you for taking part. What I'd like to do quickly is set the scene in a minute or so, and then I want to put some questions to each of our three panelists to help frame this debate, and then have at least 20 minutes or so for me to field questions that will come through from you, the audience, to me, then I can direct them to our panelists. And then by about 10 to 2, we'll be in a position, I hope, to make some closing remarks, 1 minute or so each from our panellists, and then for me to make some wrapping up remarks. So without any further ado, let me maybe quickly set the scene. I think the original focus on this session was, you know, can we achieve gender equality without quality childhood, early childhood learning? And the quick answer is no, we can't. So let's get that off the table. We can't do it, so we have to focus on how we not only provide a brilliant early childhood learning system in this wealthy country of ours, because in so doing, we'll look after our kids better and our families better, but we'll also look after women better. So, you know, we had a taste in 2020 through the pandemic. We had a taste, we had an inkling and a glimmer of what we could become in terms of doing better by our kids and our families and women in particular. Because under the pressure of the pandemic, the government provided free childcare, and they diverted funds into helping families through JobKeeper and so on. But they withdrew that then in July, and JobKeeper's about to be withdrawn, and there's been snapback all right from the federal government, but it's snapping back to a childcare system that is in trouble, a childcare system that is precarious. We now pay some of the highest costs in the world for childcare. The government funding systems are not working well. There are many cash-strapped families who are now being faced with winding back their access to childcare. Childcare fees drain family savings, stops a lot of people from being able to put the kind of food on the table they want to put on the table, makes people, it's difficult for people to meet their everyday expenses. Economic security for women is under challenge in that respect, and families suffer. Childcare costs at the moment means that after housing costs, it's the greatest cost facing our families. So it's a no-brainer, I think. It has to be a lot cheaper and possibly even free. The long-term benefits of a universal, accessible, affordable, quality childcare system are unarguable in my book. We'll come to that later. So it's not in a great position at all. We are a wealthy country. We can actually afford to have a significantly improved childcare system, but it's clearly not going to come unless all of us here today and everybody else we can think of puts our shoulders to the wheel and takes our politicians kicking and screaming into the future. So that's as I see it, the context. The pandemic exposed some really good sides to this country, but it exposed some real weaknesses. And one of them is our childcare system. So what I'd like to do now, having introduced our speakers, is maybe throw, first of all, I think, to Fiona, because I was struck, Fiona, in a 2003 Kenneth Meyer lecture, you talked of modernity's paradox, in which increasing wealth and opportunity has resulted in increased social difference and more problems for youth and children, including asthma, obesity, binge drinking, mental health problems. And you argued in that lecture the challenge was for cross-disciplinary approaches, but for intervention earlier in causal cycles. That was 2003. Switch now 18 years on. In your view, can we extend this notion of modernity's paradox to our inability at a political level nationally as a wealthy country to provide a universal, accessible, affordable, quality early childhood system? So over to you, Fiona, to make something of this tantalising phrase, the modernity paradox.
Thank you for the Dorothy Dixer, Mary. I mean, you've put forward so many of the of the issues and the solutions, but you're absolutely right. And I hate to say from 2003, I told you so. I told you that if we didn't get this right then and intervene early and provide that across the board support for early childhood, and we did get it up, you see, we did get it up. Even with John Howard, we got it up. And I can't believe that in 2021, the blood pouring from me bashing my head against the brick wall, at the age of 75, I am still lobbying for a universal, freely accessible early childhood service as the best intervention, the best investment that any nation can do for the future of its economic and sustainable activities. The UNICEF report card pre-COVID, the last UNICEF report card came out pre-COVID. And you're absolutely right. Before COVID, we weren't doing well. So we must not snap back. In that report card, Australia had fallen down to the lower third, just above the US, who of course is doing very badly on many of these outcomes. Come back to Joe Biden in a minute. We had fallen, we had not improved. And the other thing that made me really anguished was that for some areas, we didn't provide the data. What is that saying? We've got the data. We didn't want to be ranked. We didn't want to be ranked in some of the educational outcomes, the mental health outcomes, children not feeling safe, and the huge inequalities. What's happened with this neo-capitalist, extreme neo-capitalist agenda is rising inequalities in Australia, much more so in America, but here too. And that has been a disaster for many women, many children. And so along comes COVID. And in a minute, we switch to a JobKeeper, to a free child. We showed that the privatisation of childcare, aged care, health services and prisons was not good. It's not, if you want to make money out of welfare services, then that is not the way to go. And so I think that showed beautifully that we should not snap back to a pre-COVID neo-capitalist extreme agenda, let the marketplace do it, bring coal back, bring gas back, all of the things that were evidence. They took notice of us during the epidemic. You can not only spell epidemiology, you know what I do. So, the science was paramount. We cannot snap back to not taking on board the science. And I just don't mean for climate change, I mean for early childhood. So my quick sort of summary, I don't want to keep on talking forever, but the evidence now is so clear that quality pregnancy and early childhood environments are the most important keystone to prevention and good public health for any nation. It's the most important intervention that we can do, and cost effectively so. It's for two reasons, two big reasons. You get very many more children. If you had this freely available, high quality environments in pregnancy and childhood, you would have more children growing up healthy and being able to participate in society as good adults. They'll be good parents, they'll be good teachers, they'll be good doctors, they'll be good childcare workers, they'll be good everything. So that is very, very good for our economy, if you want to put it in that sort of way. But what it also does is to reduce these huge budgets with end of pathway expenditure on developmental disorders, learning problems, school truancy, disabilities, mental health problems, child abuse, out-of-home care, contact with the justice system. And I just want to quote one study that we've done in Western Australia, and Carol Bauer and her team at the Telethon Kids Institute. In the Banksia Detention Centre with 10 to 18-year-olds, excuse me if I get emotional here because it devastates me, this stuff. Okay, they showed that nearly 90% of children in the Banksia Detention Centre had developed a serious neurodevelopmental disorder, intellectual disability, 36% had FASD, and very few had been diagnosed before they got into the centre. Now, I find this extraordinary. The majority of these could have been prevented by very good early childhood services. And we've shown that so well. I'm amazed that we still have things like Banksia Detention, Dondale, all these places with huge expenditure when we're not actually investing in the high quality childcare services. People don't seem to be able to understand causal pathways, Mary. And apart from the humane arguments about how awful it is that we lock up kids whose stolen generation parents and grandparents drank in pregnancy because of their despair, and now we lock up the children and grandchildren. But the positive pathways to enhance our national future is, and with much less expenditure on these expensive end stage treatments. I've just given you the justice one, but it's in education and disability and all those other things.
Yeah.
So that's my big hypothesis. I'm sorry to keep on talking.
No, not at all. And before I do go to Rana and Christina, and it's so interesting listening to you, because you made me think, well, when I was dealing with my partner with childcare issues and quality early childhood issues,
Yes.
a quarter of a century ago, it was actually in better nick then than it is now.
That's what I wonder, that, with this neo-capitalist agenda, how we've marginalised so many more people. Post-war, we had a sort of capitalist agenda with a human face, much like the social democracies of the Scandinavian countries, when Sweden is one of our, places up there. So, so in fact, as Thatcher, Reagan and Milton Friedman said, just create wealth and it'll trickle. That's been devastating. So I think, that's why JobKeeper and free childcare was so good, because what it said was, we're going to get around that extreme, let the market solve everything.
Okay, so Fiona, and so before I do go to Rana and Christina, I wanted to give you an early opportunity to comment more specifically around the debate and the implications for Indigenous peoples, because one of the things that I must say, I've had an incredibly inspiring opportunity to get to know the work of June Oscar, and in supporting June yourself. And I've never forgotten the inspiration that both June Oscar and yourself carry around the work that was done on fetal alcohol syndrome and so on. Yeah. So would you mind just, as quickly as possible though, to just make sure that we put a line in the sand around doing the best by Indigenous people when we are talking about childcare reform?
Okay, well, June is outstanding, and she's on another webinar, which is why she can't be on this webinar. She's on the Closing the Gap webinar, which is at the Australia Institute this morning. And June and I have worked together. She's done a PhD with us. She did the best fetal alcohol syndrome prevention and management plan in the world in the Fitzroy Valley, and the research is ongoing, very high rates. But the point about First Nations early childhood services is that SNAKE and their group of wonderful Aboriginal controlled early childhood services are very different from the kinds of policies that this government is putting out, which are really making huge barriers for Aboriginal women to access childcare. But what was so brilliant about these, about 70, 75 Aboriginal controlled early childhood centres, epitomised by June Oscar in the Kimberley, but also your Birrup Willem here in Victoria, urban Victoria. What they were centres. And they were centres of culture and learning and elders and employment for mums and art and going out on country and language and so on, in addition to the provision of childcare. And it dramatically increased the number of kids ready for school, Aboriginal kids ready for school, because in fact, they weren't run by government departments. They were that Aboriginal people don't trust, because they took the children away, and they still take the children away, and they police things about. So what these centres did was to provide a holistic Aboriginal controlled trusted service, and they were absolutely brilliant. Now, when Turnbull was Prime Minister, and then under Abbott, and Simon Birmingham and Nigel Scullion, they stopped funding them federally. Having set them up, built buildings, everything, they stopped funding them. So we went and lobbied, and what they said was, now this is after months of not responding to us, they then came back and said, this is now a state responsibility. I have to say very quickly, I presume we're allowed to say things against the government here, but we went to a group of Aboriginal people and myself from SNAKE, went to see Simon Birmingham and Nigel Scullion, and Simon Birmingham looked at me in front of these people and said, they're only 3% of the population.
Okay.
And I said, this is life and death for these guys. And it is. You can put kids on a road to participation, or to all the other things that end up in Dondale and Banksia. That's how important it is. So we need to lobby separately to help the June Oscars and to help the other people who are still going, these centres. I don't know how they manage to do it, but they're passionate. We have to help them. It's a different, see, the current government policies do not help Aboriginal women. Sorry.
Fiona, fantastic, but we'll move on. So my question to Christina, in your capacity as CEO of Verve, Christina, you know, you've got your head around the issue of economic security in women every day. It seems to me, in putting a question to you, that, you know, we commonly use the phrase, this is a win-win situation. And it struck me in thinking about this session that we're talking about this as a win-win-win-win-win situation, because not in order of priority, we get an economic boost in terms of workforce participation with women especially. If we fix our childcare system, we increase the lifetime earnings for women who are behind the 8 ball now. We generate increased levels of economic security, not just for women, but for families. We can decrease the pressure, economic and social pressure, on those experiencing even greater levels of hardship and distress. We can nation build for kids as the next generations. So that's at least 5 big wins. It's not rocket science, is it? We're not daydreaming here. So why is something so apparent, so beneficial to this nation? Why are we lagging? What are the blockers, Christina? Can you have a go at that for us?
Yeah, thank you. And also just thanks for starting with Fiona's commentary, because I think, you know, I spend so much of my time having to argue this on economic terms, and it's just so frustrating that so often you kind of just miss the whole benefit to actually children and families in this. So I'm so glad we started like that. But yeah, I think you're right. You know, it's something that we've spent a lot of time over the last 8 months, just like I've just been thinking a lot about that question. We last year we launched a campaign actually with Georgie Dent and a couple of other women's organisations called Make It Free, which was really campaigning for continuation of free childcare. And, you know, it is just one of those things. It's just every corner you turn, there's just win, win, win. It's hard to imagine that coming out of COVID, there could have been a policy that the government could have implemented that could have had a greater impact on restoring the economy than bringing in free childcare. And there's just numerous reasons for that. And one that I think a lot of people don't realise, I would really like to highlight, is if you look at just how many jobs are in childcare. So we know that the government coming out of COVID really, really heavily invested in construction. And, you know, they had a really strong ideology that it was male jobs in construction that was going to pull us out of COVID, kind of ignoring the whole fact that, you know, you know, as we'd seen in the media a lot, that it was a, you know, a pink recession with the blue recovery. But just to kind of understand why people were calling it that, if you look at childcare, so the Australian Institute did great research on this, and they said for every $1 million that the Australian government spends on childcare, it creates 10.6 direct jobs for women. So these aren't even considering yet the women that can go back to work because their child's in care. It creates 10.6 jobs for women and 4.3 direct jobs for men for every $1 million. Now, if you compare that to construction, for every $1 million you spend, you get 0.2 jobs for women and 1 job for a man. So even if you're just looking at this in terms of recovery, childcare would have been a fantastic industry to invest in, as would have health and other industries as well. And then, of course, you look at other factors, like Australia is really well known for having just incredibly poor rates of workforce participation amongst women in the OECD, and particularly single mothers. So if you look at the OECD, there's only 2 countries, so Turkey and Ireland, that have worst workforce participation rates for single mothers. And that's just appalling. At the same time, you've got the government has really acknowledged this from economic perspective. So there's a whole lot of government reports sort of that acknowledge that if we could get more women into the workforce, we could boost the economy by $25 billion. And you've also got these wonderful graphs that show, so if you look at the OECD graphs and you look at you know, hours that children spend and enrollment rates of children in early childhood, and you look at women's workforce participation, you could virtually draw a straight line through those countries. The countries that have invested in it have great workforce participation, the countries that haven't don't. And so then I think it really, you know, there's really only one answer to this that you can get to, and that's that in this situation where the government had huge amounts of money to spend on recovery, where it has all this data at its hand and it doesn't invest in it, I think at some point you've got to step back and think, this is ideology. You know, it's ideology that it's men that will drive the labour market forward and drive our economy forward. It's not data, it's not good economics. You know, and then we kind of continually see this almost victim blaming of women, and women made to feel like they can't manage their money and they can't, you know, that they're somehow supposed to, you know, it's kind of their fault if they can't get back into the workforce. You know, but really you're seeing none of the institutional factors in place that would support women back in. And I just can't think of any other reason than just deep-seated ideology that women's role really is to be in the home at this point. That's my own conclusion.
Yeah, okay. I can see, I would think it's ideology plus looking at public policy through the prism of institutionalized political power that is largely still male, where in that setting, the value that's attached to a big yellow tractor driving around is a lot greater than it is to bringing up a child. Anyhow,
what about the lobbying, Mary? What about the lobbying? What about
absolutely.
those lobbyists? I mean,
Yeah.
they're absolutely, you know, lacking any kind of, you know, humanity or credibility. Absolutely.
Well, we'll have to come.
It's all about money for them. Sorry to.
No. I'm with you, and maybe at the end when we draw this together, Fiona, you know, we know about the nuanced and the invisible, unaccountable lobbying that goes on, and I think what we're talking about, even with this session today, is joining part of a much broader community lobbying around these issues. So let's come back to that. Last but not least, a question to you, Rana Hussain. I mentioned at the outset that, you know, your passion and your professional commitment is around inclusion and cultural diversity. In large measure, your work in sport. But from the ground up, I want to know from you today, in your expert view, how do we improve a childcare system in this country without leaving a lot of people behind? We can talk about inclusion. How do we actually make sure that our practice is inclusionary? So would you like to take this up in terms of a very important reminder that one of the things to be gotten right in this campaign is that a lot of people aren't left behind?
Absolutely. And I think sport is a great example of where it doesn't work, especially the AFL industry is full of young women who haven't had their kids yet. They leave, they go and do what they want to do, and then they come back, you know, at jobs that they're way more qualified for, but, you know, they can't really get back in the door where they should. So it's super relevant for sport, and we see players as well having to deal with it. How do you be more inclusive? Well, I guess, you know, our voices need to be part of the conversation. How do you actually do that? God, I wish I had the list or, you know, a quick answer for it. I think for me, you know, if there's not room in the room where these decisions are being made, if there's not room there, if we're not willing to do that, then we need some really robust fact finding in communities. We need to go out to communities, go to them, have conversations with them, and speak to them in the way that they speak about these issues. Give, you know, and I don't just mean in you know, culturally diverse language, but just in the terms that they see their own lives, have the conversation at that level and really hear what they're saying and what they need. And what I'm hearing and what I hear in my life is that one size doesn't fit all. And so we need to understand the different needs of different pockets of people. I know for me and my friends that we look for culturally inclusive childcare options. And a lot of Muslim women I know will opt out of sending their child to generic kind of childcare environments because they want the cultural understanding and they want the religious values. It's important to them, and so they'll opt for play groups, or they'll opt for childcare options where they see people that look and sound a little bit more like them. And so we need to consider that in this whole conversation, I think. The other thing for me is the conversation has to include dads. A lot of families, these decisions are made together. Sometimes they're not, and that's a challenge in itself, but we need to understand what the dads are doing. If they're not part of the conversation, why aren't they? You know, what is it that they need as well in this dynamic, and what are their barriers that they face? I think guilt is still an issue for a lot of women too. And so for me, the storytelling around motherhood is a big part of this still. I know that that's changed a lot, but this morning I sat at a cafe with a friend who talked about the guilt she felt dropping her child off at childcare this morning, because her doctor has said you need time for yourself. You're not getting any time to actually invest in you as a human being. Yet she was still so distraught at having to do that, and the trauma she felt at having to do that. And so we so often center this around women's ability to stay in the workplace. What about just parents' ability to be okay and deal with life and cope with their day? Childcare plays a huge part of that, and that's the conversation. Really, what we're saying is whether you use that time to work or use that time to invest in yourself, we need childcare to be accessible. Sorry, I'm getting really passionate, but it's frustrating to me that we're still lagging in this way. And a lot of migrant women I know come from places where mothering is a communal thing. And so they're not averse to childcare as a concept, but the options are just not workable. The flexibility, childcare, if they're working, childcare set up near their home, not near their work or in their workplace, which would be such a much more workable solution for a lot of families. So I could go on, but I feel like I should stop and let people ask questions.
Yeah, well, Rana, thank you. That's great. I think, you know, what a simple proposition to hold by, to make room in the room. And I'm quite sure that the essential media people and the Thrive by 5 people who are helping with this session today, I think that's a great short statement for them to take away as well. Make room in the room as the attempts to mobilise people around this campaign proceed. Thank you for that. I'm just conscious we need to also make sure that we've got time for our audience to pose questions. And, you know, we're dealing with the technological challenge of me coming in by phone on this and me now having to look at my emails to see questions coming in. But there is a question, and I hope I've got your name right, Seidel Fernandez from Women's Health in the North. Your question is to Christina. Can you please, Christina, share with us the further reading that you used around the stats for how many jobs are created as per 1 million spent for women and men? Because that was a great point in your presentation. So if you could share that with us readily now or follow up, that would be great.
Yeah, I actually saw that comment and I was sort of typing a little bit while you guys were commenting. So it's actually the Australia Institute. I've popped in a reference, a link into the chat about where Richard Dennis from the Australian Institute quotes the report, and maybe afterwards we can try to find a link and potentially send it in the follow-up email. But I think if you check out that Australian Institute link I sent, you can probably work your way to the report.
Okay, and it seems to me, Rana, from your point, it ties in very beautifully with an earlier point made by Fiona when she was talking about her partnership work with June Oscar, that one size is not fitting all, and people on the ground know this, like yourself and like June Oscar. So I guess one of the important takeaways in this discussion, that in framing this quality, universal, accessible, affordable childcare system, that it's powered by a really sophisticated understanding and a commitment to making sure that different and diverse communities are at the table, and that the system can in fact provide a suite of options that is appropriate for people on the ground.
Can
I think
just
that's
say
been
something on that, is that so often we hear that message that there needs to be diverse voices, but we get stuck by, oh no, but how do we hire someone? We just need to kind of throw the rule book out a little bit and get creative and innovative around how we hear their voices, and get their input. You know, let's not get bogged down in what's the formal way to do that. If it's just reaching out to whoever and build and build and build, but the point is we hear them, not, you know, necessarily the formalized way of doing it. But I see people getting bogged down in that stuff.
Yeah, no, and that's great, Rana. And I think, again, you know, this session is something that the Women's Trust has undertaken as part of its commitment to the Thrive by 5 campaign, and Essential Media is helping drive that. And so I think that's a great takeaway for them. Throw the book out and just get on with the business of reaching out and listening to the people who know what the suite of options must look like. So that's a great point made.
I'd just like to really support what Rana said, and I think this happens not just with the First Nations populations, but the principles of early childhood, of pregnancy and early childhood care and support are there. We know them. We know what the principles are. How they're implemented, we need to do what Rana suggested, and that is we need to go and engage the populations and the people and the groups and the mothers who know how they live. They know where they live and how they live and the context in which they're living. And when you do that, you get a system like with the Aboriginal response to the pandemic, which is the best in the world, the complete reversal of the gap, because Aboriginal people were put in charge of what should happen. It's a fabulous example of what you were talking about, Rana, but it also gives power to the women. It will probably even help maternal guilt, which I still have, even though I'm a grandmother. I'm still working off my maternal guilt of, 40 years ago with my kids, and I'm a great grandmother, that's fine, but it's just that it shouldn't. I remember sort of saying then, I'm going to make sure we get rid of this maternal guilt. But what we did was break the glass ceiling, but not change the workplace. And that's, I think, another big issue of how we need to change the workplace and I think the question we were given today is whether will we get gender equality without childcare. I think it's the other way around. Unless we get gender equality, we're not going to get a lot of these changes. And so it's pushing for gender equality that's going to make a difference to things like childcare and to things like what we need to do in the workplace. And the more women we get there, and the whole sexual harassment stuff that we're going through now, which is anguishing.
Yeah, and I think, Fiona, following on from that, I think even here in Victoria, I think we've started to see in legislative terms some of the impacts of having a government that is gender parity around the cabinet table. We're seeing legislation that's a bit bolder, it's a bit more imaginative, around voluntary assisted dying and so on. So there is no doubt that we have to push hard on getting much greater representation in our legislature, as well as tackling the monolithic concentration of male power that is vested in our parliamentary institutions. And I think the last several weeks have shown that we can't just be talking about sexual harassment inquiries. We have to actually chisel away at the bastion itself that perpetuates this policy indifference. So, Christine, I want to come back. We've got another question here on how do we get men to see this as their issue too. So, in your thinking of people, working in the finance and the superannuation sector, I mean, Richard Dennis said once to us in a speech that a lot of men aren't interested in the childcare issue, not simply because they're not the primary carers, but because they are happy to see childcare workers paid at low rates to look after their prized assets, their children. How do we actually get a cultural turnaround and an involvement in a lot more guys in the childcare campaign?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think that COVID's really provided this incredible learning experience for so many households and so many men, because I think for the first time, I think so many men suddenly realised what that work entails and what life is like when that support isn't provided, isn't available. And so I do think this is a really, you know, we're in a really incredible point of time to be advocating for this. And I think that when it comes to getting more men involved, I think the issue also relates to getting more women involved. And I think that the answer to me, or a big part of the answer, is actually the same. And I think it's just opening people's eyes up to what they can expect. And I think once again, or what they should expect from their taxpayers' dollars. And I think once again, COVID's provided a good opportunity to do this. You know, like even today, I was responding to some social media posts on our Facebook, you know, by women who were sort of questioning, like, you know, well, why should we get paid super when we're at home looking after our children? Like, why would we? Because we're not working. And it's not until you tell people, well, look, like in other countries, people do get retirement benefits when they're at home caring. And in other countries, there is actually affordable or free universal early childhood education. And in those countries, they're not necessarily paying more tax than us. Often they're paying less. So it's really a prioritisation. And I think that it's really about kind of opening people's eyes to what they can and should demand and expect. And I think the other good thing about COVID is that we suddenly saw that, you know, all these like issues we had with budgets balancing and not having enough money and having to cut this social service and that social service. And suddenly there's just hundreds of millions of dollars flying around. Big corporations can get a JobKeeper suddenly. And so I think that I think that has opened up people's experiences to, okay, well, what is possible? And the answer is that anything's possible. Government could tomorrow choose to stop subsidising fossil fuel companies and instead, you know, subsidise early childhood education. And it's all how we prioritise. And I think it's, for men and women, I think a big part of it is opening up people's minds to what is available internationally and what other countries are doing. And then why shouldn't we have that in Australia? And then I think the second thing is getting people, you know, to vote on this. And there was a great article in the Guardian recently that was like, you know, is this kind of momentum around women, is this going to be enough now to start shifting votes? Or will people sort of see it as another issue that they care about, but it's not enough to shift their vote? And so I think that's really going to be the important driver going forward.
Yeah. Okay. So Christina, just a quick question. One of our audience asked, which country is the gold standard for early childhood education? I mean, I'm looking at what I think is a fantastic publication from the Parenthood that Georgie Dent would have been able to talk about today, which is called Making Australia the Best Place in the World to be a Parent. And this report lists the UK, Norway, New Zealand and Sweden as being sort of, you know, out on their well ahead of Australia. And not surprisingly, we are well ahead of the United States and we are behind on the OECD average. So which country is the gold standard in your view?
Yeah, I was actually going to throw that one to Fiona, but I think those Scandinavian countries all have, you know, quite good policies around that. And I think your point about the US is really important. I think just in general on all these policies, we need to start shifting our attention to what is Europe doing, what are the leaders doing, and not instead what's the US doing. And I think we're sort of following, you know, in so many ways where we're drifting more and more towards the US. Look at the mess that they're in. I think it's a really inspiring time to be looking at what is Europe doing well and how can we learn from countries globally that are doing the best. So maybe Fiona's got some good insights into specific country policies.
Yeah, so Fiona, quickly over to you.
You've certainly mentioned the Scandinavian countries, in particular Sweden, sort of like the gold standard. And to those countries, I would add South Korea. South Korea's had terrific early childhood. But if you add pregnancy into it, I'd add in Cuba. You know, Cuba's had an absolute turnaround, and they had such poverty, they had low literacy rates, and investing in women, huge investment in women in Cuba. 100% of pregnant women in Cuba have received antenatal care with ultrasound by 20 weeks. I mean, it's fantastic. In America, Cuba now has an under 5 mortality, which is lower than America, even though they're one of the poorest countries in the world. We call them the paradoxical countries, where you've got poverty and very good outcomes. And then there are the very wealthy Arab countries that are very wealthy and have appalling outcomes. But America's getting worse, so we should not be looking at America. Their low birth weight rates are rising. There are a whole lot of things. But I just wanted to quickly mention Biden. Now, there's been two big studies in the US, one from the American Academy of Health and Medical Sciences, and the other one from Arts and Sciences. And both of them have pointed to what to do about child poverty. And of course, they use the Swedish data and many other countries to do it. And Biden has slipped into his big passage, payments to families to attack childhood poverty. It's fantastic. So that's the only thing I would look at in America from Biden's speech. They've got a long way to go, but he's taken international comparisons. I think doing international comparisons is very good. It shows us who's good and it shames us.
Yeah. Look, I am conscious as moderator of the time, and we've got the limits now of just wrapping up in the next 5 to 10 minutes. So, and one question from the audience I'll come back to. So I wonder if I could ask each of you, Fiona and Rana and Christina, just now to give us in a minute each a final reflection, at least from today. What would be one of the most important things you want to say for people to take away and think about as a result of this discussion and the issue more broadly? I will go to you again, Fiona, if you don't mind.
No, that's fine. I'll be quick. I've been looking at the chats as much as I can, and I think the chats need to be captured. There's some fabulous comments in the chats.
I'll come back to that.
And I'm very inspired by some of the comments there. Joan Garvin has said Estonia is another country, and of course I forgot about Estonia, and I've been there and seen how good they are. I'm just sort of wondering, with all of this and this incredible evidence and passion and commitment from more than 50% of the population, we should be able to do something. And I wonder whether, people have asked about how we lobby and what should we be doing. And I wonder whether the Productivity Commission, we got them to do things before in terms of our childhood outcomes, but bringing in the Dennis, Richard Dennis stuff from the Australia Institute, the stuff that Christina's doing, Rana and so on, whether in fact we couldn't get the Productivity Commission to take this on to show how important investment, not a cost, investment this is for the nation.
Thank you. Rana, what about you as a closing reflection?
Yeah, and I just want to, the comments are incredible. I just want to acknowledge the fact that we've been talking about things as in terms of mothering and motherhood, but what we're actually saying is parenting, and acknowledge that queer communities have a whole other experience around this, single parent. So, and basically then my point is that we do this work inclusively, and we do make sure that we bring people and different perspectives to the table when we do it, and do it collectively. Yep,
thank you. And Christina?
Yeah, I think we're actually close on this. Maybe I'm optimistic because I think Fiona's got that longer term perspective, but I feel like we could be close. I think we could be close on this issue now. And I think that there's so many wonderful, I can see, the quality of people who are commenting as well. I feel like with the collective group we have here, that I think there is a real opportunity to build momentum, particularly, potentially having an election this year, early next year, to really put this on the radar. And okay. I think the other thing I just wanted to say is, I think I've just taken away that, from the comments of Rana and Fiona, that in the campaign we were doing, we should have done a lot more to include inclusive voices, because although we spoke about Aboriginal women, I didn't know, and we didn't know about those centres that had been closed, which isn't really good enough. And I think that's something we need to go back and add into our campaign as well. So, I think it's just a big reminder that we're all learning and we're all developing and we're all doing the best we can.
Yeah, thanks, Christina. And
the other thing that's come through the chats, Mary, is this, what we haven't touched on is how the undervaluing of early childhood educators and the staff. You mentioned it when we started off, and I think that's just so important. And when we get more women into positions of power, they will value these positions that aren't properly funded, where they're not properly given opportunity for continuing education, all those things, which many of these countries we've talked about, and I add Finland in now in terms of the education system, where there's continuing education and giving people power to improve their own circumstances, which gets back to Rana's point about giving people power to improve their own services.
And I think also, an implication for the Thrive by 5 campaign in the lobbying for a better early childhood system, that the question of the paid workers in that system has to be to the fore, as indeed does the question of how to best support a lot of the people who volunteer in these systems, which are, again, for the most part, women, being a crucial volunteering component in the delivery of the services. I just wanted to throw in a question before I wrap up from Julie in our audience, who I think very importantly puts her finger on the need for employers to discharge their accountabilities in terms of providing truly flexible workplaces, which just would make it a little bit easier for both men and women to be working these things out. Christina, do you want to have a little crack at that before I wind up?
Yeah, I was just going to say, because I actually wrote something on this morning, and at Verve, like, we have fully flexible working hours. You can work any hours you want, and we just focus on performance. So it's performance outcomes, and it's not focused on hours at the desk. And I just don't understand why companies are being so moving on this. And again, I think we're just at a really interesting time of how companies are going to come out of COVID, because some are keeping their flexibility and some are not. I think ultimately employees want it. The best companies and the companies that want to attract the best talent are going to have to adapt, because some companies are certainly keeping their flexibility coming out of COVID. So once again, something to be optimistic on, but I just do not understand why more companies don't bring in flexibility.
Okay, thank you. And look, another audience member, Moo Borch, asks, how do we support early childhood educators and administrative staff voices to be part of this too? And I think maybe I could just answer that by saying, one of the things that I would like to do at the Women's Trust when we sit down with Essential Media and the Thrive by 5 campaign people in the next day or so to debrief from this event is to point out some of these really important practical matters that have come through this discussion that they need to take into their campaign thinking, such as how are they going to actually reach out and talk to early childhood educators and administrative staff about joining this campaign. The same with employers. So I think we might do it that way, of using it as part of the debrief back to Thrive by 5. I do need to wrap up in a number of ways, and one is to say that we will certainly at the Women's Trust do our bit to capture the questions and the resources that popped up in the session itself today, and have that available on our website for people to follow up. So thank you for that. It's been a bit weird not being able to see that in any clarity from my point of being on my phone as the moderator. So I look forward to seeing them in the whole. I'd really like to urge people to join us at the Trust in the way we can try and play a role in advocating on these issues. Join the Thrive by 5 campaign along with other campaigns to lobby for a better system. The Thrive by 5 campaign, as I understand it, is really going to try and work hard at the national lobbying point of view to have the tin ears and the concrete walls and whatever. The tin ears sort of giving way to listening ears and the concrete walls mounted. It's sure as hell needed. We need to mobilise as people. We need to come together. We need to press. We need to demand. We need to lobby. We need not to take no for an answer. So, I'm thinking back to the March for Justice on Monday that many of us were at, although we couldn't march, but we could gather and assemble. But I'm thinking of that old, marching, that marching cry of, what do we want? Well, we want cheaper or free, early, high quality, universal, accessible, affordable childcare in this country. And when do we want it? Well, we basically want it now. We want to start getting it in 2021, 2022. We don't want to wait another 9 years or another 25. How galling today to think that people like Fiona Stanley saw a better system a quarter of a century ago. I mean, that's pretty damning on this lucky country. So I'd like to draw it to a close by thanking everybody for their participation. I'd like to thank our panelists, Christina, Rana, Fiona.
Thank you.
And I do hope that Georgie Dent picks up and is restored in the next day or so, because she does such great work through the Parenthood. I'd like to thank our Auslan connections for making things subtitled as they were today. I'd love, obviously, to thank the trust staff, the Victorian Women's Trust staff, who do, I think, who make me feel proud of the organisation by the way they pull these events off. Love to thank the Thrive by Five and Essential Media people for enabling us to bring this session together today for you. And at Essential Media, thanks Jane Garcia, thanks Afsa Haque, and thanks Zareen Katakutan. It's been fantastic working with you. So thank you everyone, and stay strong, get your walking shoes out again, and not take no for an answer over the next 12 to 18 months as this nation works its politics out around where we're going as a country. So thank you and stay well.